everybody. I'm Simon Haynes. A very warm welcome to our first Ramsay Centre live lecture event for this year. Welcome from me, also on behalf of our chairman, John Howard, who unfortunately was delayed at the last minute and couldn't come, but also from Joe de Bruin from the Ramsay board, who's here with us. Good to see a big turnout, getting bigger as we speak, as we return to this beautiful room in the State Library. Do please keep coming this year to our live events, and do keep watching our online events and our various conversations. And as ever, a very special welcome to our wonderful Ramsay scholars. Could you give me a wave? Thanks for coming, you guys, and bring your friends, keep coming during the year. You are, as always, the most important people in the room. So, welcome to everybody, and as usual, I'd like to start by acknowledging our wonderful benefactor, the late, great Paul Ramsay, without whom nothing that we do, the scholarships that we offer at undergraduate level, postgraduate level, the university support for the humanities, or any of these events, none of that would be possible without his truly unique legacy. So thank you, Paul. Now, 1 year ago, we kicked off the 2023 program with a panel discussion offering a contemporary Australian perspective on Western civilization with Paul Kelly and Dave Sharma and John Lee. And this year, in a somewhat similar kind of commencement vein, we're beginning the year with a discussion of Australia's strategic position between China and the United States. And just to recap, other speakers last year, whether live or online, reflected at various times on the eccentricity and weirdness of the West, on the Socratic method, on the history wars and cancel culture, on secondary education in Australia and on liberal education in the United States. And similarly, this year we'll be hearing from, among others, Andrew Kern, who is the founder and president of the Circe Institute, the Centre for Independent Research in Classical Education you may have heard of. If you haven't, check the Circe website for some fabulous material. He's been one of the major people driving the classical liberal arts education movement in the US for the last 30 years. So that's something to look forward to in the not too distant future. We're also hoping to welcome Michael Wesley, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Melbourne University, previously at the Lowy Institute and ONA, and he'll be talking about the state of contemporary universities. And also later in the year, the incomparable Bettany Hughes. We think we finally tracked Bettany down and persuaded her to join us, the Cambridge historian and broadcaster. She'll be telling us about her latest bestseller called 7 Wonders of the Ancient World. And so much more during the year, including the wonderful Ramsay Writers events over the road at Ramsay, with readings from distinguished Australian poets and other writers, reflecting on their own work and on classical influences on their work. And also, of course, new podcasts, including, we hope, on Putin and Russia, and possibly more on China, classical China. So there's a lot to look forward to, but now to tonight's feast. We have no less than 4 speakers of great distinction, and I'll introduce them in order in that direction. And the event, just to say that the event will be moderated by our very own Jack Sexton, our academic manager, ex-Chicago Committee on Social Thought. Right, Jack? So, the speakers, starting with the first one here, Sam Roggeveen is Director of the International Security Program at the Lowy Institute. He's also the author of, and I've been finding it a fascinating read, the Echidna Strategy, Australia's Search for Power and Peace, which was published, I think, Sam, just a little bit earlier this year, or late last year. Before joining Lowy, Sam Roggeveen was a senior strategic analyst in Australia's peak intelligence agency, the Office of National Assessments, as those of us who worked there in the old days still think of it as. It's now ONI, of course. Sam has also worked on arms control policy in the Department of Foreign Affairs and as an analyst in the Defence Intelligence Organisation. He has a long-standing interest in politics and political philosophy, and in 2019 he wrote Our Very Own Brexit, Australia's Hollow Politics and Where It Could Lead Us, about the hollowing out of Western democracy and its implications for us in Australia. He writes for newspapers and magazines in Australia and around the world, and is a regular commentator on the Lowy Institute's digital magazine, The Interpreter, of which he was the founding editor from 2007 to 2014. I'll just keep going with the introductions rather than pause after each one. So to Sam's left is Dr. Lavina Lee. Lavina is a senior lecturer in the Department of Security Studies and Criminology at Macquarie University. She was appointed to the Council of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute by the Defence Minister from 2020 to 23, and was previously a director of the Institute for Regional Security. Lavina is also a non-resident fellow of the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, as well as a non-resident senior fellow at the US, gosh, I hope that's not mine, at the US Studies Centre. She is the author of the book US Hegemony and International Legitimacy, Norms, Power and Followership in the Wars on Iraq, and has published a great many articles, book chapters, research reports and commentary on maritime security and strategy in the Indo-Pacific, on the Quad, Australia, India, Japan, the US, Indian foreign and security policy, and the US-Australia alliance. And Lavina also periodically publishes opinion pieces you may have seen in The Australian, the Fin Review, the Hindustan Times, and the New Straits Times. So welcome to you too, Lavina. And then next to Lavina is my old friend, Dr. Milton Osborne. So nice to see you here, Milton. He was a non-resident fellow at the Lowy Institute for International Policy for 10 years, and he's been associated with Southeast Asia for more than 60 years, since being posted to the Australian Embassy in Phnom Penh in 1959. He's held academic positions in Australia, the UK, the US, and Singapore. In 1980 and 81, Dr. Osborne was a consultant to the UN High Commissioner on Refugees in relation to the Cambodian refugee problem. And in 82, he was appointed head of the Asia branch at the aforementioned Office of National Assessments, also serving for a year as head of current intelligence. I think you must have arrived just after I left. Right. Since 1993, Milton has been an independent writer and consultant on Asian issues based in Sydney, and he's been an adjunct professor and visiting fellow in the Faculty of Asian Studies at the ANU. He's the author of 11 books and many articles on Asian subjects, including the widely acclaimed Southeast Asia and Introductory History, which is now in its 14th edition, many other books. He was honoured in 2014 by the French government, appointed as Commandeur in the Ordre National du Mérite for his past work with French officials and his contribution to the study of France's role in Asia. In 2021, Milton Osborne was appointed a member of the Order of Australia. And then, far end of the row, I'd like to introduce Dr. Michael Green, who is the Chief Executive Officer at the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. Michael Green held appointments previously at Georgetown University, including as Henry A. Kissinger Chair at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. He also served on the staff of the National Security Council from 2001 through 2005, including as Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for Asia. Before that, he held a number of appointments at Johns Hopkins University and was Senior Advisor on Asia in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He also worked in Japan on the staff of a member of the National Diet. Dr. Green is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Aspen Strategy Group and sits on the editorial boards of the Washington Quarterly and the Journal of Unification Studies in Korea. And he's authored a great many books and articles on East Asian security, including most recently, and Mike, I hope I've got this right, By More Than Providence, Grand Strategy and American Power in the Asia-Pacific since 1783. He also, he informs us, holds a black belt in sword fighting. What's it called? Iaido. Oh. And he has won international prizes on the great Highland bagpipes. So, a man of many talents.
A man of many talents.
Yeah, indeed. So that's our wonderful lineup. The event is entitled Navigating the Crossroads. So, Jack, over to you.
Thank you, Simon. Well, Sam, I'll start with you, if I may, since you've recently published a book, and not just any book either, but one that has, I won't say upset the apple cart, but which has provoked a vigorous debate about what exactly Australia's defence strategy should be. I think it's fair to say, and I think you would agree with this, Sam, that the debate provoked by your book has been rather uneven, and that in large part because it has been public. At the moment, government insiders, including those from both major parties, are nearly all committed to a broadly similar strategy that assumes a very close relationship with the United States, and a United States that remains strongly present in Asia. But your book questions whether this is really the right strategy, and it has received favourable reviews and endorsements from at least one former Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, in case anyone was wondering, former Minister of Foreign Affairs Gareth Evans, and several commentators including James Curran, now the Financial Review's international editor, all of which suggest that there is a constituency in Australia for your arguments, even if that constituency is not currently well represented amongst decision makers. Now, many people who are not French at least, might say that the significance of the AUKUS deal struck in 2021 has been exaggerated, that Australia acquiring nuclear submarine technology does not, or will not, because we don't have the boats yet, do we, Sam? Mean that Australia has really altered in any significant way its defence strategy. But just what the deal means is itself a subject of debate, and one way to frame the debate about AUKUS is to put it in the context of longer-running debates about Australian defence strategy, some of them so long-running it might be fair to call them permanent. In particular, AUKUS would seem to raise a question that exercised Australian defence policy planners both before and after the Second World War, and that is whether Australia should focus on defending the Australian continent or homeland from attack, or instead adopt a policy of forward defence, meeting threats well beyond Australia's borders. Of course, these may not be simple alternatives, but as Gareth Evans put it in his review of your book, quote, "The big strategic question raised squarely by the AUKUS submarine acquisition decision is just how long the echidna's spiky quills need to be." So, Sam, perhaps you could kick us off by saying something about how AUKUS brings together many of the questions that have long exercised Australian defence policy planners and that will continue to be questions in the foreseeable future.
Great. Well, thank you, Jack, and thank you to the Ramsay Centre for making us so welcome here tonight, and thank you to all of you for coming. If I can be forgiven a small correction to your introduction, actually, the book came out about a week before Father's Day last year.
Yep.
And if you'll indulge me, a 30-second story. A colleague of mine at the Lowy Institute bought the book for his dad for Father's Day, and he took it home, and his dad pulled one of the great dad moves on him. He took it home, and his dad unwrapped it, took a look at it, and his son said to him, "Dad, one of my colleagues at the Lowy Institute wrote that book." And his dad goes, "You mean to tell me your colleague is giving away books for free and now you're passing it off as my Father's Day present?" And his son goes, No, Dad, I went to the bookshop especially and I bought one for you. And he goes, you mean to tell me your colleague's written a book and you couldn't even get a copy for free?
My father Sam talks about rare unsigned copies of his books. So, so this is a bit of a theme, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm happy to sign any if someone's got one, but I will lower the value. So, look, so you're absolutely right, Jack, to say that the AUKUS debate has really become a proxy for a very old debate in Australia about defence policy. And that, to put it crudely, and I stress crudely, is really a distinction between the school of forward defence, as you mentioned, and the Defence of Australia school. So the Defence of Australia school, if both sides are asked to answer the question, what is the Australian Defence Force for, then the Defence of Australia school says, again, crudely, the job of the Australian Defence Force is to defend the Australian continent and our air and maritime approaches. The Forward Defence School says, actually, the job of the Australian Defence Force is, with the assistance of our great power ally, to maintain a favourable regional order. And hence, that means the emphasis moves from simply defending the continent to defending further out from the continent. And those differences in worldview, those differences in policy get embodied, consecrated, if you will, in weapons. So the kind of weapons that you buy for the first kind of strategy are different to the ones you buy for the second kind of strategy. And Australian defence policy has drifted a little bit between those two poles over time. In the 1980s, the Defence of Australia school became ascendant under the ministerial leadership of Kim Beazley, the famous DIB report. And I think beginning around the time of the 9/11, the war on terrorism, and thereafter, I think we've drifted towards a more forward defence posture. And at the moment, we're in something of an in-between state because we've gone back to a Labor government now, and Labor governments tend to lean more towards the Defence of Australia school. And early last year, the new Albanese government produced a mini white paper, which essentially I read it as a document that embraced that old Defence of Australia idea, but with some modern add-ons. However, the Albanese government had also, even before that time, endorsed AUKUS, fully endorsed AUKUS. Now, I would argue, as I said, defence policy gets embodied in weapons, the weapons you buy. And it seems to me the AUKUS, and in particular the nuclear-powered submarines, are very much a product of a forward defence school of Australian defence policy. Because the key characteristics of nuclear-powered submarines are long range and long endurance. They are designed to be operated far from Australian shores. And I argue in my book that they're actually that they are designed for a strategy of hemming the Chinese Navy in along its coastline and even to fire missiles onto the Chinese mainland with the assistance of the US Navy. So we're effectively building an adjunct to the US Navy's submarine fleet. So it seems to me what is hanging on this debate is how you regard the role of the United States in our security and its regional role. That to me is the question on which everything else depends. And my reading of America, and I stress this is not a kind of a moral judgment I'm making about the United States, about its courage or its conviction or its character. I'm merely making a prudential judgment about American interests. And my prudential judgment about American interests is that the United States simply doesn't have enough at stake to be a reliable partner for Australia in our security, or to be a reliable partner for its other allies in the Asia Pacific. And again, I stress that's not a judgment about American courage or its character. It's purely a judgment about its interests. And the reason interests are so central here is because China is such a big challenge. China is the biggest rival the United States has ever faced, much bigger than the Soviet Union, certainly by economic measures, but increasingly by military measures as well. So to take on a rival as big as the United States, you need a really good reason. You need an existential reason. And my argument in the book is simply that despite China's size and despite its capability, it doesn't threaten the vital interests of the United States. It certainly threatens the vital interests of Australia and of Japan and Korea and many other states, but it doesn't threaten the vital interests of the United States. And that means we have to do more for ourselves. And AUKUS is, I think, the wrong way to go about that job of Australia doing more for itself in defence terms.
Thank you, Sam. Certainly food for thought. Michael, you're next.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. This is a lovely building. I haven't been here before.
Yes.
And I have followed the Ramsay Center since I arrived a year and a half ago with my wife and 2 kids and 2 dogs, Invasion Day as my wife calls it, and followed the Ramsay Center, and I'm delighted to be now inside the tent, so thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Look, I really enjoy strategic history. I've written a strategic history of Japan. The book you referenced by More Than Providence is a 800-page history of the U.S. strategic debates and approaches to this region since the American Revolution. So these schools of thought, these debates are really important. You need to know where you came from. But I would just start by saying the Australian school Sam described, the defense of Australia and the forward defense, are there and have little to do with the strategic reality in the Indo-Pacific today. These are debates that came up at a time when the United States had unrivaled predominance over the air and maritime domains in the Indo-Pacific, including when I worked in the Pentagon in the 1990s, when China bracketed Taiwan with missiles to threaten Taiwan in 1995-96. The US was able to send 2 carrier battle groups through the South China Sea, past Hainan, with impunity. So these debates took place in a time when the choice was, how much do we support the US global security system in the Gulf or in Iraq and so forth? How much do we focus on the defense of Australia? But it was all occurring at a time when the Indo-Pacific was not contested. And today the reality is that this is a contested and dangerous environment. And so the old schools have some relevance, but they're not the answers to the problems Australia faces. And it is a significant challenge. I could spend an hour just rattling off what's different. The 4 artificial island bases that China built in the South China Sea, each of them larger than Sydney Airport, 10 times the size of an American aircraft carrier, fully operational with bombers, fighters, missiles, blanketing control over the South China Sea, the foreign interference, the pressure on Australia, embargoes, the pressure on the Philippines. China is building 6 submarine pens in Gwadar, Pakistan, 2 for Pakistan, 4 for the Chinese in Hanbon Tota. And there's a long list we can go into, but this is a very, very ambitious, aggressive, and coercive strategy that was not as evident when I was in the White House dealing with Xi Jinping. I was in all of President Bush's meetings with Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. It was a different intent from Beijing. We can debate when it changed. To me, it changed with Xi Jinping, and it's about essentially ending the American alliance system and asserting China's claims and dominance in the region. That's not the environment where the earlier debates with Hugh White and others about defense of Australia or forward defense were happening. It's a completely new environment. So what do you do about it? You're right to question American staying power. If America doesn't have staying power, it's a big, big problem. You need capabilities that allow you to deter and impose cost and put at risk anyone who would threaten you. The Chinese have more ships than the US Navy now. They're not as good, but they have more. They have more missiles tactically in the region. They have a presence and an envelope that makes it very dangerous to be above the water or in the air. So where do you go? Under the water. And the US submarine capability is, most public estimates say, 15 years ahead of China. It's the one area where we have a huge advantage. So the Australian government back in around 2012 decided it needed nuclear-powered subs to survive and deter in this environment, because they can stay underwater for 6 to 8 months. You don't know where they are. They pack a punch. It makes it very, very challenging for anyone to attempt to blockade, embargo, approach Australia. But they decided, and they were right, that the US would not transfer the crown jewels, the nuclear propulsion technology. But then we did. And the US did because the American people are also scared of China. And because the government, the Biden administration decided Australia needs capability. The US needs Australia to be able to defend itself effectively. It's the same reason the US is transferring major technology to India, Tomahawk missiles to Japan. That would never have happened 5 years ago, because we need our allies to have the ability to deter and defend themselves as part of a network. So it's in Australia's interests if deterrence and stability and sovereignty matter. It's not, it's complicated. These are expensive. The first submarine officers from the Royal Australian Navy have graduated from the nuclear school in the US. It's happening. The legislation's passed in Congress, but it's complicated. It's more complicated the smaller the defense budget is. But it makes, to me, perfect strategic sense for Australia. The Japanese and Indians are strong supporters of AUKUS because they want Australia to have that capability. And it has pretty strong bipartisan support in the US. It's only one piece of a strategy that Australia needs in this new environment, but I think it's a pretty important one.
Thank you, Michael. Lavina, speaking of American reliability, there is an election in the United States this year. You may have heard about it. There is also a country called India. Michael just mentioned India as well, which has a general election coming up this year. There is also a general election in Indonesia due to take place tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken, and which will produce a new president and administration. There are also ongoing wars in Europe and the Middle East. There's a lot going on in the world. How is Australia positioning itself, how should it position itself amidst these evolving global dynamics in 2024 and beyond?
Yeah, I think the beginning place, it is the status quo. If you want me to describe what the status quo is that we are pretty much enmeshed in the Australia-US alliance. And our three strategies to deal with this deterioration in the strategic environment that both our first two speakers have spoken about is one, to build our sovereign capabilities, and the United States is integral to that. AUKUS that we've already spoken about. We've spoken about submarines, but there's a second pillar to the AUKUS partnership, and that is all about high technology in areas like hypersonics, undersea warfare, unmanned vehicles by sea and air, quantum computing, just to name a few. And all of those things, we have some advantages, but the United States and the United Kingdom clearly have advantages too. And without that alliance that we have with the United States, we basically wouldn't have access to technologies that we now need in a much smaller time frame. Now, the Australian government, there's been a number of defence white papers. I shouldn't say white papers, there's a strategic update from 2020 and the Defence Strategic Review of 2023. And both of those documents say we urgently need to prepare deterrence by denial capabilities. Now, this is no longer something that we can afford to wait 10 years. The time is now. And I think, we haven't spoken about China, but I think we need to take Xi Jinping seriously when he says to his military, the PLAN, that they need to be ready by 2027 to reunify with Taiwan. So we don't know whether that is the date, but it is certainly something that he's said to his military, we need to be ready by that time. So we should take it seriously. Now, we're talking about the alliance. Conversation about Donald Trump comes up. How reliable is that alliance if we have Donald Trump as the President of the United States again? We've been there before, and actually Australia did manage it very well. So we can actually credit our previous leaders for getting on Donald Trump's good side and being able to advocate for our interests in a very good way, I think. Now, putting aside the kind of, I think, quite brutal type of analysis that he made this week, or was reported to have made, where he apparently said to one of his NATO allies that he had encouraged NATO adversaries to do their worst if they didn't step up and contribute what they should to the NATO alliance in terms of spending. Now that is very brutal. It is typical Donald Trump. But in typical Donald Trump style, I think he actually gets to a deep problem that has been there for a very long time that only he says in that kind of brutal, direct fashion. So if you look at NATO, only 11 out of 35 NATO countries actually spend 2% of GDP on military spending. So in a context where you've had Crimea in 2014, you've now got an active, ongoing, brutal conflict in Ukraine. It seems to be probably quite a reasonable suggestion to say, well, our NATO allies need to step up and they need to do better. And you can see some countries have. The ones on the front line, like Poland, has doubled its land army in the last 10 years, is spending, I think, about 3.5% of GDP on its military forces. So some countries are stepping up. But then you look at France, it's spending 1.9%, Germany 1.57%, 1.6%. So I think he does have a point. Coming back to Australia, if we anticipate a Donald Trump presidency, I think those conversations will come back to us as well. Are we doing enough within the alliance? I think the Australian government and previous governments have got the strategic assessment right about urgency and the need to develop those sovereign capabilities. But we can see, I think all of you are probably quite well informed, that we are still acting as though the urgency is not there. So we've got the strategic assessment, but we don't have the urgency in terms of building that sovereign capability as quickly as possible. There's a number of reviews. It's seemingly many reviews, review after review, and whilst the reviews go on, decisions don't get made. And you can see that defence industry is very frustrated because they have to put all their plans on hold while the reviews of the reviews take place. So I think we're going to have some harsh questions asked of us if there is a Trump presidency, but I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. It might actually mean that we work faster to do what we need to do. I think in terms of India and Indonesia, Indonesia, I think at the current level of defence spending, where it's at with its development, I think it's not, it doesn't have sufficient weight to impact the balance of power in our region, but they can do a lot to harm Australian interests. So it is, of course, in our interest to have good relations with Indonesia. In terms of India, India will always promote its strategic autonomy, given its level of development and its own strategic and security concerns in the Indian Ocean and along its border. It generally has its hands full. But then again, I do think that it's in our interest, as the United States is doing, to help India be as robust a security player, to be a net contributor to security in the Indian Ocean. And that is in our interests, even if we can't necessarily rely on India to come into our part of the region and join us in Taiwan, for example. But it's still important that India can play a role in maintaining a military balance in the Indian Ocean.
Thank you, Lavina. Milton, as Simon mentioned, your association with Southeast Asia began in 1959 when you were posted to Phnom Penh, possibly in part, you suggest in your memoirs, because in a social cricket match you dropped a catch off the bowling of the legendary Sir Arthur Tang, then Departmental Secretary in the Department of External Affairs. Is that really true? And when I ask that, I mean...
I did drop the catch.
Did you really drop the catch? Yes, that's it. You really dropped the catch. Well, in any case, since then you have been a resident, student and observer of a region that defies easy summary or categorisation, especially for those who try to impose on it political and intellectual categories derived from the history of other parts of the world. The great Austrian foreign minister, Clemens von Metternich, famously said in 1814, I think it was, that, quote, Italy is a geographical expression, by which he meant that until Italy was a nation, it would be a subject or even a victim of European affairs rather than an actor in them. Southeast Asia is not Italy, that's for sure, and if the region only contained Indonesia, it would still be one of the most important regions in the world. But is it nonetheless still fair to ask the question, is Southeast Asia really anything more than a geographic expression? That is, can we expect the nations of Southeast Asia, either individually or collectively, to play anything more than a balancing role in a world defined by truly great powers like the United States and China?
Thank you, Jack, and thank you to the Ramsay Foundation. It's a perfectly fair question, and with a courtly bow to Count Metternich, von Metternich.
Von Metternich.
Yes, Southeast Asia is a geographical expression. And although most of my working life has in fact been spent on contemporary issues, I will offer a little history lesson. Southeast Asia as a term is effectively a neologism. It was not used in any common fashion until the Second World War. Before that time, people had very broad, rather unanchored phrases to describe what we now call Southeast Asia. Asia of the monsoons, further India, which scarcely applies to Vietnam. It became a geographical expression that had strategic importance during the Second World War, and it's been adopted overall since. But it is, on the one hand, a description of an area that is sizable in population, but enormously diverse in character. And that's despite certain unities or generalities that you can observe, such as the widespread use of Austronesian language, Malay, Bahasa, or the remarkable presence of Thai dialects in mainland Southeast Asia. But when we talk about the region, even if it has a population exceeding 600 million, which makes it about 8% of the world population, think of the tremendous differences that apply between Indonesia, the only country in Southeast Asia that's so far been mentioned this evening, and Brunei, where the Malay Brunei population is less than 1 million. On the other hand, you have the diversity evident in the fact that the Philippines, with its population of 114 million, is the only Christian state in the whole of Southeast Asia. You can look at the background historically and say they all, with the exception of Thailand, were colonies. And you can see certain generalities in the experience of those colonies as they broke with the former colonial power, although there are great differences in those experiences. But to talk about the region as a whole is a mistake and I think a delusion, in the same way as I think that to talk about ASEAN as if it really is a powerful and significant body is also an illusion. We hear much about the centrality of ASEAN. Well, I'm not sure what the centrality is. I think, again, we are mistaken, and we're going to celebrate that centrality very shortly in Melbourne at a special ASEAN summit. The last summit we had, 6 years ago, didn't really work, Mr. Turnbull not accepting. We had the embarrassment of Hun Sen, the embarrassment of Najib Razak. Mr. Duette, who didn't come, was already denounced for his vigilantism, and Aung San Suu Kyi had been revealed as not quite the person we thought she was. We're going to have the same problem again. We're going to have Hun Sen's son, Hun Manet, who only recently has been saying stability is what's important. How the government is run is another thing altogether. And the government is run, of course, as an authoritarian regime with complacent courts and heavy-handed actions by the government's military and forces of order. If we're going to talk about Southeast Asia, let us do so with accuracy and discretion. Let us identify what each power actually represents, and let us indeed most particularly take full account of the 280 million Indonesians who, as Lavinia has said, have the opportunity to provide either good things for us or very bad things.
Thank you, Milton. Well, after those compelling responses, I see no reason why we shouldn't open the discussion to what is our rather large audience tonight. We have 2 roving microphones, so if people would just raise their hands and you may be chosen. Simon, CEO's privilege, why not?
Forgive me for imposing just at the beginning. Perhaps I can just start by asking a kind of ONA-type judgment question, a short to medium-term judgment question, really, which is something like, how likely is China to start a war in the next 2 to 3 years? And the sort of context I'm thinking about is that, many people would say, as long as the US doesn't provoke Beijing, or, China will never upend a status quo that suits it. And currently the status quo does suit it, including, for example, that China has just called for a new China-oriented WTO round. It's very much part of the game that it's been playing successfully for some time. Others point out China hasn't started a war since 1979, and look how that went. Others say, China will not fight in response to a slowing economy and other domestic problems because there is no Chinese history of diversionary war. So all of that is kind of reassuring, but I'm picking up on things that both Lavina and Mike were saying, and in saying that notwithstanding all of this, Beijing is amassing ships and planes and missiles as part of the largest military build-up by any country in many decades, stockpiling fuel and food, trying to reduce the vulnerability of its economy to sanctions, with an eye to what happened in the first part of the Ukraine war from a couple of years ago, steps one might take as conflict gets closer. And Xi Jinping has said China must prepare for worst-case extreme scenarios, be ready to withstand dangerous storms, and all as Beijing is becoming increasingly coercive in dealing with its neighbours, including Philippines, Japan, and India. The CIA director recently said that she seeks the capability to take Taiwan by 2027. So really, how urgent is this? Is China actually primed for war in the next 3 years, which many would say is the window that Xi Jinping has got before demography and the economy and internal unrest turn against him? Is the next 3 years a critical period in this context? Be grateful to know what any of you think.
Would someone like to go first? Sam?
I'm happy to.
Sure.
Well, the first thing to say about, we're asked for a forecast, and the first thing I'd say, and here I'm going to sort of salt the earth a little bit for my fellow panellists, so I apologise. But the first thing I'd say is that you shouldn't trust our judgments about these forecasts. So I recommend a book by the American political scientist Philip Tetlock called Expert Political Judgment, which showed pretty conclusively that political experts, have a very poor hit rate when it comes to the accuracy of their predictions. It's almost like equivalent to throwing a dart at a board or tossing a coin. So, I mean, political experts are useful for many different things, let me stress that, but predictions might not be one of them. So having said that, what I would add is that since we don't know how likely this is, and I'm actually under no illusions, I think it wouldn't shock me at all if China's ambitions did stretch to a full-scale military invasion of Taiwan. But having decided that we don't know how likely this is, we should actually default to probably it's actually a preceding question for Australia, which is how important is it for Australia? Right, what should we be planning for? So is the security of Taiwan a vital security interest for Australia? And the national debate in Australia, I think, assumes that Taiwan is a vital security interest for Australia. I don't think it is. I don't think it is, particularly when you consider the stakes of such a conflict, which would amount to a very high likelihood of not just regional war between the US and China, but full-scale war involving the exchange of nuclear weapons. When you consider the stakes, Australians, I think, should seriously ask themselves, is Taiwan important enough for Australia to contribute to its defence? I would argue, and look, I want Taiwan to maintain its current status. I never want China to invade Taiwan. I hope it never does. But a very sort of crude national interest judgment on my part says that that is not a vital interest for Australia.
Other views on this very large question?
All right, from my point of view, I think, Simon, your lead up to the question gave us a lot of facts about what Xi Jinping is actually saying. So I think there's always two sides of the equation. There's what we can do to influence that decision, but then there are also drivers within China that might be impervious to what we're actually doing. So, for example, there's a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot, but there's a school of thought within the United States that the United States and allies should be reassuring China, and that we're not reassuring China enough. In the context of Taiwan, that we're encouraging Taiwan to be independent. If you look at what occurred in the Obama period, that was the period where China built its artificial islands. And it started thinking about that when President Xi took power. It started acting on that. And previous to that, there was a lot of Chinese literature about how America was in decline after the 2008 global financial crisis, and that this was an opportunity to lock in the preferred order before the United States or others could gather their forces and oppose it. Now, in terms of the question of 2027, should we take it seriously? I thought that we should. I don't necessarily think that that's the date, but I think that the time is now to do what we can to build our capabilities to deter China and influence its strategic calculations, basically increase the costs and the risks for China of actually taking that path. And why I say as well that I think we should take it seriously, one, I think the Taiwanese take it very seriously, and the Taiwanese, if any group of people, will be analysing very closely what is said within China and analysing the development of Chinese forces. But two, also, Xi Jinping is not getting any younger. He's 70 years old. He has spoken so much about reunification as being part of his China dream, and he doesn't have that much time. And some of the facts that you talked about play into that. The fact that Chinese economy is not going so well, demographically, it's now in decline. All of these things play a part in those types of calculations in terms of the window of opportunity. But I don't think that means that we should think that this is inevitable. I also think he's extremely rational. And if he thinks that the costs are too great, he has every reason not to do it because he's primarily concerned about his own regime security. So that would be my answer to that. There's a bigger question. I don't want to monopolise this, so we can come back to it. I think what you said, Sam, that we probably should talk about. A bigger question is, we need to also imagine what the region would be like without the United States. So if we think that Taiwan isn't important, what's the consequences of letting Taiwan be reunified? What would be the consequences for the regional order, and how would that affect us? And I don't think it's a good thing. So that's where I stand on it, but I can explain why later.
So I'm not building a bomb shelter under our house in Dover Heights. I suspect the Willara Council wouldn't approve it if I tried.
No.
The economic damage to China of war would be massive. So Dan Rosen at the Rhodium Group in New York, who's not a China critic, most of his career has been calculating, doing macroeconomic modeling of Chinese foreign direct investment in the US and other things. He's done a study which suggests a conventional war between the US and its allies in China would cost at least $10 trillion to the global economy. And when you model it, it's much worse for China than for the US, Europe, or Australia, much worse. So should be a pretty strong reason not to do it. On the other hand, in 1912, Norman Angell published his famous book saying economic interdependence between Germany, Britain, and France made war impossible. Less well known, in the 1920s and 30s, the chairman of J.P. Morgan and other bankers in the U.S. were going around giving speeches that the U.S. and Japan were so economically interdependent, which we were, that war was unthinkable. In 1928, the Treaty of Locarno outlawed war. That was wrong. There was a theory in the 90s that two countries that had McDonald's had never fought a war. Ukraine and Russia. Well, Russia doesn't have McDonald's anymore because they pulled out. But they both had McDonald's. So, economic interdependence.
It's damaged their war efforts, though.
Yes. Build more McDonald's. That's our policy recommendation. Economic interdependence should be, and usually is, a very powerful disincentive, but until it isn't. And the other challenge with predicting, and the reason Norman Angell was wrong and Thomas Lamont of J.P. Morgan was wrong in the 20s and 30s, is because you're looking at the situation now. And often these large wars, World War I, World War II, happened because of the collapse of power in a third arena that drew in. So turn to Professor Osborne, but Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, it's the collapse of cohesion and power that in Japan attacked Pearl Harbor because the War Cabinet concluded that after the fall of France and the Battle of Britain, the South and Holland, the Southeast Asian colonies would be easy pickings. The Balkans and the weakness of the Balkans drove Hitler. So, we're looking at the U.S. and China, but we should really be looking at Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, because events can turn very, very quickly that create dynamics. And I would not predict a war. I think deterrence works, but I would predict that there will be a major crisis or incident in the next 2-3 years because of the significant number of fighters and destroyers and frigates, not all American and Chinese, Canadian, Japanese, sometimes Australian, and the Chinese, particularly the PLA Air Force, rule of engagement is very aggressive, coming within 10 feet of U.S. planes. So there will be an incident. It's almost certain. It won't lead to a war, but the tensions are problematic. On Taiwan, should Australia be involved if there's a Taiwan contingency? We asked that in our annual survey at the U.S. Study Center 2 years in a row. About half of Australians say yes. About 15 to 20% say no. Look, it completely depends. Americans, when they're asked, it's about the same. About 50 to 55% say yes, but it really depends. I mean, I don't think this will happen, but if the president of Taiwan declares independence, we're not going to fight for that, right? So the scenario really depends. But I think Australians and Americans at some level recognize what it would mean if China successfully, with force, with a war or just boycott, sanctions, blockade, successfully forcefully unified and coerced Taiwan. It would cut off Japan. The first island chain, the Japanese view of this is that it's existential. If it's existential for Japan, in my view, it should be pretty bloody important for Australia. TSMC is the largest producer of high-end chips, basically in Taiwan, so it's the Ruhr Valley. And what it would do to the U.S. alliance system and nuclear proliferation. So should Australia be involved? How should Australia be involved? That's a real debate. Does it matter? I would think, like I said, if it's existential for Japan, and if half of Americans, and by the way, in polls, when people are asked, would you fight? You normally don't get a majority. So I think it should be front of mind for Australia. What the policy should be, how to handle it, that's Sam's right, that's a fair debate. But it's not something to sort of put in the back shelf and say, not my problem, I think.
Milton, final thought on this?
Well, the first thought that comes to mind is that China is achieving much of what it wants without having to do a great deal. To use Gareth Evans' pithy expression, Laos and Cambodia are fully paid up subsidiaries already. It's achieved a role which I ventured to say in a Lowy paper 16 years ago of being the paramount power in the region. And although the Indonesian leadership has always said that they don't want to take a position, they are very much indebted to China, one way or another. Look at the nickel mining, most particularly. So I have no prediction to make about war. I'm the Yogi Berra school of thought. Particularly hard to make predictions about the future. But all of what Mike has just said, I think, is well worth looking at.
You can use Yogi Berra quotes in Australia?
I know who he is, Michael.
Thank you. That's the most important thing I've learned tonight. I mean, a lot of good strategy too. Yeah.
Perhaps a question from this side of the room. Yes, the gentleman in the front row.
There are, I suspect, I'm not alone thinking that AUKUS is an interesting treaty. The submarines are the least interesting part of it. My own strong feeling is that by the time we actually get them, or anything like them, they'll be about as useful as Spanish galleons. But in the meantime, the first parts of the treaty, the parts that are now operative relating to cyber warfare and other factors of that sort, are far more interesting. And really, if one looks at the history of wars, the first thing that hits you is the technology surmounts almost everything else. And the one thing that hasn't been mentioned today at all is cyber warfare. Now, we are actually, together with every country in the world, incredibly at risk in this area. On an almost daily basis, various of our utilities, companies, or what have you, to hacker attacks that probably begin in Russia or who knows where. But there's a vulnerability that's global, it's not just here. And this is an element which sort of doesn't seem to play much, not much is said about this in terms of likely warfare and how it really reacts and how we should fit in it. For my part, actually, I think this is rather to our benefit. We have the ability now to be fairly active in that area. Countries as a whole, somehow it's a bit like atomic weapons. They're not yet being really used. Cyber warfare is not really being used in an offensive fashion. It is in the odd foray, but not in a cohesive fashion. But if you can imagine what a cohesive cyber attack on this country would do, it would be devastating. And quite frankly, a lot of weaponry becomes irrelevant. Can I have your comment on that?
Lavina, have you worked on cyber warfare or something?
I wouldn't say I was a specialist in
Yeah,
it,
but
no.
well, perhaps you could respond first, nonetheless.
Look, I don't think we haven't talked about it, but I think it's a given that we're talking about conflict in the context of a Taiwan conflict. Cyber will be one of the first things that are used. So if you're saying that it's an important part of our domains of warfare, it is considered the fifth domain of warfare now. And in terms of debates, the debates are not about will it be used? Of course it will be used. And our defences, we're building our defences. And we are apparently very, very adept at cyber warfare, one of the most adept in the world, Australia. I think in terms of peacetime, I think that's where the more interesting questions become. What do we do in peacetime? But in warfare, it will definitely be a big part of both what we need to defend against, but also how we might use it offensively.
But that alters the whole technology, the whole strategy of war.
Not really.
No.
Well, it complicates it.
Right.
Cyber doesn't mean that submarines or missiles are irrelevant. It just complicates everything. And it makes the scenario of escalation to war more likely, not less likely. The director of national intelligence in the US publicly 2 weeks ago, I think, testified that it's China's strategy, and they're developing plans and capabilities to take out critical infrastructure in the US and our allies, which means Australia, Japan. We're talking power grids, hospitals, insurance, banking. That's dangerous because there could be a view, well, we're not shooting at anyone, but people would die, and it would be economic warfare. And then what's the line between retaliating with cyber versus retaliating with cruise missiles? And so it sort of lubricates in dangerous ways the escalatory dangers, including nuclear. You know, Russia used cyber to attack a Viasat satellite at the beginning of the Ukraine war. If cyber is used to blind satellites, that means you're blind in terms of nuclear threats and intentions. So it really is dangerous. But Lavina is right, I think. among the Five Eyes, the US, UK, and Australia are particularly adept at offensive cyber, and so it's possible to deter, but that would not be true of Japan, it wouldn't be true of the Philippines, it wouldn't be true of Germany. So there's a lot of softer targets who are treaty allies of the United States. So it's a really good point, and it sort of gets to your question. It's one of those things, sort of like railroads in World War I, relatively new technology that just accelerated the escalation. I do think that Virginia-class submarines will be deployed by the Royal Australian Navy, but at some point in the future, it's going to have to be about drones and autonomous vehicles. That's true undersea and in the air. And it's surprisingly, there's a lot of in the press about how DPM Marls is fighting with the department about this, but pilots and Navy captains don't like drones and autonomous things because, you know, it's new. That's what you'll have, I think, a mix of Virginia-class subs and autonomous vehicles.
Sam?
Well, there are examples we can draw on of weapons that have utterly changed the face of warfare. Dreadnoughts, nuclear weapons have both, and there are other examples of truly revolutionary military weapons, but most of the time, new weapons are not revolutionary, they are evolutionary, and they complicate warfare in the way that, that Mike is saying. Cyber war has been tried, I think, by the Russians in Ukraine pretty extensively, and the results, I think, have been a little underwhelming. A lot of attempts were made to disable the Ukrainian electricity grid, and when that failed, the Russians went back to using high explosives instead. They fired cruise missiles at the power grid. Actually, that hasn't worked either. Ukrainian power generation has returned to pre-war levels. So they're having a lot of trouble doing that. Look, ultimately, and I think this is a point that Mike alluded to, warfare is the application of violence in the pursuit of political aims. And the question that hangs over cyber warfare for me is it violent enough?
Milton, you get the last word again, if you want it. Perhaps we could have a question from this side of the room this time. Moving back. There's one there, yes.
Good evening all, my name's David. Could it be that China leverages North Korea for a proxy war on South Korea and Japan? So, you know, at arm's length to create, you know, problems where they sort of say it's not us, but it's North Korea.
I've been to North Korea, not for family vacation, but when I was in government to negotiate with North Koreans, which was an interesting experience.
You weren't part of the pro wrestling crew that went in the 90s?
No, or the Dennis Rodman basketball crew.
Yeah.
I was part of the boring nuclear negotiations. The North Koreans hate the Chinese. And on the Chinese side of the border, when the North Koreans do nuclear tests, you can feel them in Shenyang, and anti-North Korea sentiment is really strong in China. The Chinese have to worry about proliferation. The last thing Beijing wants to see is Japan and South Korea develop nuclear weapons because of North Korea. So there are a lot of limitations on how much Beijing can sort of, it's a dangerous card for China too. That said, the trends are not great. You know, North Korea is providing weapons to Russia. China and Russia, in a way that didn't happen when I was in government, are supporting North Korea in the UN Security Council, stopping sanctions, stopping inquiries. This is dangerous because it gives Kim Jong-un and Pyongyang more room to play and cause mischief. And it's hard to fix because in China and Russia, they are linking it to everything else. You want help on North Korea? Stop, you know, supporting Taiwan, stop supporting Ukraine. So it's a very, very tough diplomatic problem. I would actually criticize the Biden administration and other US allies for not trying. I mean, they put it in the too hard to do box. And I think this is a diplomatic problem that is too important to not address.
Other thoughts before we move on?
No, I think Mike made a good point about nuclear proliferation, that, you know, China doesn't want South Korea and Japan to go nuclear, to question the nuclear umbrella. And South Korea only recently, they've been talking about their interest in acquiring nuclear weapons, and the Biden administration basically put the hard word on them and also reassured them and said, no, we've got your back, so you don't need them. But that's always a stress point. So I think in the grand scheme of things, that I don't think China would be encouraging that as a means to an ends.
Might come back to this side in the second row, yes.
Going back to the very first point about the echidna strategy, isn't our reliance on air and sea lanes, plus the fact that our fuel reserves are in America, and the report in yesterday's paper, I think that we have 5 days supply of or reserves of ammunition, plus the fact that with cyber warfare, the development of hypersonics and so forth, isn't the question of defending a homeland as opposed to a strategy which is further out rather moot now? Don't we have to be out there rather than echidna curled up like a hedgehog, waiting and starving probably and running out of ammunition and fuel very rapidly?
I should have said, Michael, an echidna is an Australian marsupial.
Oh, I've seen echidna. Yeah.
Was this, I mean, Sam, was this phrase porcupine strategy, porcupine doctrine was the original for?
Yeah, for Taiwan.
For Taiwan?
Yeah. That's partly what I was alluding to. Look, there's a section of the book devoted to this point, and
Apologies for not having...
No, not at all, not at all. Sorry, that's not what I meant to imply. So the counter argument here is that Australia is incredibly difficult to isolate and incredibly difficult to starve, as you put it. I'm all in favour, by the way, of Australia developing greater military and strategic resilience. You refer to our fuel reserves being in the United States rather than onshore. That's a poor state of affairs. The Silver Star would be to bring more of those reserves onshore. The Gold Star, and you're going to hate this, Piers, is to electrify our entire transport system so that we don't need any fuels anymore, right? We can rely much more on renewables and on onshore power generation rather than on liquid fuels. But the broader point I would make is that Australia, just being so large, is very difficult to isolate militarily. You can, for a short time, blockade one or maybe a couple of our ports, but to do it for months on end and to do it, to blockade every port and blockade Australian air routes, that is probably beyond the capabilities even of the United States military, because it is such a huge job, because our territory and our sea approaches are so vast and so difficult to blockade. So, I mean, certainly the costs of bringing trade to Australia can go up because of coercive tactics by an adversary. Insurance rates can rise if shipping companies feel it's dangerous to come to Australia. But to actually blockade Australia to an extent that it forces us to change policy, to an extent that it forces us to buckle under pressure, that is incredibly difficult.
So I think that's a 19th century concept of blockade. And in the 21st century, you don't have to surround Australia. You have to hit the Straits of Malacca, the South China Sea, and then very handy if you have a submarine base in, say, I don't know, Vanuatu. It's about strategic choke points in geography. I also think you're making an important point, which is geography and distance is not security in an era of intercontinental ballistic missiles, cyber, and foreign interference. The debate, interestingly, as I've seen it, has been about, so what does Australia need to defend itself and how much can it rely on the United States? What I think should be more of the debate is how does Australia do more with India, with Japan, with Indonesia, with Korea, because all of them are having the same strategic problem. And how does Australia connect its security more? And it came from Delhi 2 weeks ago. India was skeptical about Australia for a while, not anymore. Japan has designated Australia its most important security partner after the US. Korea now is much more engaged than it has been. So that's a key part of the strategy that should be out there and discussed is how does Australia connect more with other middle powers, Japan's more than a middle power, that are similarly looking at the US. Support for the US alliance in Japan is over 90%. It's over 90% in Korea. In Australia, I don't know why, we're not lovable right now, but for whatever reason, support's high. But these are also countries that are looking at the US and debating this, and looking at China. And we're not going to see a NATO in this region. We're not going to see a collective security architecture unless China really plays its hand badly. But the really important dynamic is the connectivity between the security of Australia and the security of Japan, and the security of the Philippines, the security of India. And that is not a defense of Australia strategy. That's a strategy where this multipolar collection of states does what it can to be a net exporter of security in its own subregion and create a patchwork under the US alliance system that just makes war or coercion less attractive. I'm glad we talked about Indonesia, we touched on India, Japan came up. That to me is, for Australia and for the US, huge advantage. That's our play.
There was another question just on this side before we move over.
Hi, my name's Stephen. Look, I'd like to pick up the idea that Australia's AUKUS nuclear submarines can have any deterrent effect on China. It reminds me of the famous headline from the 1890s, Hobart warns the Tsar. At most, 2, or if we're lucky, 3 will be operational at any one time. They'll be an adjunct to US deterrent capability rather than giving Australia a sovereign ability to deter China from doing anything it wants. Whereas I'd like to pick up a point that Milton made about Indonesia. If anyone wants to do Australia harm, Jokowi has indicated that he wants Indonesia to become the world's 4th largest economy by 2045, and looking at all the economic statistics, they're very much headed in that direction. If we look at the broad sweep of history, having the world's 4th largest economy on our doorstep, within sort of rowing distance from Australia, if any power to the north of us wish to do Australia harm, and Indonesia's on our side, it would be much harder for them than if Indonesia is on the other side of that conflict. So it seems to me that the fact that we are kind of ignoring the Indonesian election in favour of a little poll in the audience, how many people know some of Donald Trump's policies? I won't ask for a show of hands. How many people know any of Prabowo's policies? I suspect the answer would be very much fewer. And yet it's much more important for us. And if we're looking at deterrence, it seems building that relationship is probably the more important priority for us.
Milton, perhaps you could respond to this first, and
I'm all in favour of us doing everything we can not to provoke Indonesia in any way to achieve the possible pinpricks that Indonesia could inflict upon us. And we do wait to see whether Prabowo Subianto is going to be the next president of Indonesia. I'm sure Sam is right that it's very difficult to blockade Australia overall, but if we lost our sea lanes of communication and we had overnight flight problems with Indonesia, it would cost us more, just as blocking the Straits of Malacca would be a problem for us. So there's nothing that we can immediately see that Indonesia is likely to do, but it could make life more difficult for us.
what about language education, Milton, foreign language education in Australia?
Oh, that's a disaster. I think I've heard Mike speak about this.
Me? In Japanese.
One reason people know so much more, the Americans speak English, or kind of.
You were reflecting on the
one factor here.
sad demise of Indonesian teaching in Australia.
I mean, it takes 4 years to learn Japanese, Korean, and Chinese, and 9 months to learn Bahasa Indonesian. I would think a lot of students would be all for.
They use the Roman alphabet, don't they, Michael?
Sorry?
They use the Roman alphabet. There's no excuse.
I think Indonesia is incredibly important, and the point about Prabowo and the election is a really good one. You know, you could, in Washington, you'd be hard-pressed to get an expert roundtable where people knew much about Prabowo at all, but they would all know about Kishida and Yoon and Albanese. And you know, the U.S. is particularly guilty. I was pleased, my home university, Georgetown, Jokowi spoke there 2 months ago and announced that Georgetown's going to be opening a campus in Jakarta. And you know, it's about educational exchange, it's about teaching Bahasa Indonesian, it's about connecting with think tanks, government. At the end of the day, Indonesia is not going to provide Australia with a nuclear umbrella or anywhere near the level of U.S. foreign direct investment or technology, but I like the way Professor Osborne put it. It may be a long time before Indonesia is a net exporter of positive security for Australia, but if Indonesia's weak and porous, it's a huge problem for Australia and for the U.S. It should be a much higher priority.
We've only got time for one more question, I'm afraid. But perhaps one of the Ramsay scholars would like to ask a question. We like not to get through one of these events without hearing from them. But it's not compulsory. There is a question right up the back, yes.
Well, we've seen in places like Taiwan with the recent election, and then also in China since 2019, not due to COVID, but probably symptomatic of it, there has seemed to be a growing shift in what the populations think of reunification or possible conflict in Taiwan. I think there was a lot of support in the recent election for Taiwan becoming independent. And then in the US, I think it was alluded to earlier, they're in a state of sort of internal turmoil that hasn't been the case for a long while. Is there a potential that Taiwan isn't the sort of catalyst for a big global conflict that everyone seems to be betting it is?
I missed the last part. I chanced that.
Could you just repeat the last part of the question?
Sorry, with the sort of difference between populations and policy at the moment, is there a chance that Taiwan isn't the catalyst for a big global conflict that we think it is? Is there the potential that populations actually are going to become a bit more vocal and their effect on policy will change some of the bigger powers' actions or behaviours in the region?
So perhaps the question is, does Taiwan really loom as large for the mainland Chinese as it at least often appears it does?
Well, I think all of us would agree that peace is much more likely than war. The concern is that the percentages are shifting slightly.
Right.
The one thing, I've no expertise to offer on the attitudes of the Taiwanese population, although I know that there have certainly been shifts towards Taiwanese nationalism rather than Chinese nationalism, and that feeds some, fears on the mainland that of formal separatism. But the one thing I would say that's sort of the missing for me in Taiwan is that they're just not spending enough themselves on defence. In GDP terms, I think they spend less than Australia. I think when I look at it from a distance, Taiwan should be a kind of garrison state. It should look like Israel or Finland, universal conscription, a massive, it does have conscription, but, with a lot of shortcomings. But Taiwan doesn't resemble those kinds of places, and I sometimes wonder why.
We went to Taipei right after the Ukraine, invasion. And it was very interesting. The Biden administration sent a group of former officials, which happens a lot because you can't send the Secretary of State or Defense because we don't have diplomatic relations with Taiwan. So they'll send previous people, so I was part of a delegation to meet with Tsai Ing-wen, the president, and others, and the Taiwanese TV, 24 hours, was showing Mariupol or showing Kyiv and saying, this is new Taipei City, this is what this building would be if it were us. They brought back conscription to a full year, which had shrunk, but I agree with Sam, they need to do more. The Taiwan identity, which you're pointing to, the polls show pretty clearly that the vast majority of Taiwanese see themselves as not the same people as the mainland. That's alarming for Beijing, because Beijing always could count on some group that would want to unify someday, and that group has just shrunk to single digits in the polling. But it's partly China's fault. Beijing offered one country, two systems, like Hong Kong. And then the Taiwanese people saw what happened in Hong Kong. I don't know if any of you seen the musical Hamilton. There's a fantastic scene. I saw it in Chicago and London. It was very interesting seeing it in London.
It was banned here in Australia, Michael.
Was it? It was here in Australia. We hosted the cast, actually, at the center. But there's a scene where King George III sings, after the Americans declare independence, he sings, "I will kill your friends and family to remind you of my love." And during the election, the previous election, Beijing had YouTube and other videos singing unification songs with beautiful pictures of Taiwan and then pictures of China. And then at the end of the video, they literally had pictures of PLA bombers blowing up targets. And so it's Xi Jinping's fault. The debate among China and Taiwan scholars generally, especially in the US, is will Xi Jinping use force only because Taiwan wants a divorce? In other words, if President Lai or the DPP came out and said, we're independent, that in the past, Beijing has said would be a cause for war. So, if you divorce me, I'll shoot you. Or is it that, if you don't marry me, I'll shoot you? Is it if you don't unify, we're going to attack? And people are really parsing what Xi Jinping is saying. And it's very clever because some of it is sort of a bit ambiguous, but my view of it is that the weight of what Xi Jinping is saying is resistance is futile. He told President Biden in San Francisco the US should support China's unification of Taiwan on China's terms because time is not on our side. He didn't say time is on our side, he said we will not wait forever. So the fact that the Taiwanese people don't want to unify could be, I think is increasingly a risk. If the scenario was a Taiwanese leader said we're independent, that would be such a provocative thing. It would be hard to get Australian or American publics behind. But I think the more likely scenario increasingly is not high, but the more dangerous scenario is that Xi is not going to wait forever. But it's really hard to say. It's really hard to say. People are parsing what Xi Jinping is saying. They're certainly seeing the military preparations. So Taiwan matters.
We're out of time, I'm afraid. Would you please thank our wonderful panelists?